So good afternoon and welcome everyone to our webinar. New year, new data, RS Means 2016 Construction Cost Insights. My name is Nicole Benke and I will be today's moderator. Thanks for joining us today, and one of the things we hope that you take away is that this presentation will lay a better foundation in demonstrating the pricing intricacies in materials and labor when basing it off whole index prices. We hope that you'll see the importance of not generalizing index prices without truly having a detailed understanding of the decrease and increase in the range, in the range pricing level of materials and labor. We also hope to show you that the labor and material trends, as well as highlight the top 20 most CSI material line items. And I don't want to spoil the data you're about to see, but I do think it's safe to say that no matter what materials you tend to use the most, they've likely been impacted with a significant level of change in price. Our session today will optimistically prove the need for you to avoid risk by depending on up-to-date, reliable data. And at the close of the webinar, you'll automatically be prompted to complete a short survey. Your feedback is important to us in creating future webinars and understanding the needs you have. I do want to remind you guys that this is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants. And a few more mundane items to take care of before we kick off. Please note the GoToWebinar toolbar, which is probably located on the right side of your screen. You can click the small red arrow to see your toolbar if it's not showing up. If you'd like to ask a question during any point of the webinar, please submit them in the question box, which is located within that toolbox. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties, go ahead and put your issues in that question box as well, and our team on this side will do everything we can to take care of you. Now on to our special guest today and our speaker. We have Chris Anderson, the Vice President of Data and Consulting from RS Means from the Gordian Group. And during our question and answer session, we'll bring on Bob Mewis, who's the Director of Cost Engineering also with RS Means at the Gordian Group. We wanted to bring him in to join our discussion to offer more detail and depth explanations for those that may have any questions. One of the things we like to do in our webinars is to keep it interactive, and with that, I have a polling question I'd like to start with the audience. So you'll notice on your screen, the question is, which format of published cost data do you use? You can make a selection from online application, CD, book, multiple formats, or I don't use published data. All right, it looks like the majority of our audience today uses online application to access their published cost data. So thanks again for participating in that. So again, as I mentioned, we'll go ahead and kick it off the webinar with Chris Anderson and get down to the real reason you guys came today. And with that, I would like to introduce Chris Anderson, the Vice President of Data and consult.
Both the RS Means Online, the CD, and the books that we publish. We have 20 trade-specific books, but also a number of other data formats that are available through RS Means Online. All of the price changes that we're going to talk about today apply to all of those areas, both across unit lines as well as assemblies and square foot models, which we'll cover in detail shortly. I'd also like to remind you that we have 930 location factors through the City Cost Index, CCI, that we will also talk about in detail today. All of those areas are thoroughly costed on a daily basis. those price changes are updated most frequently in RS Means Online, and I'd also like to highlight to you now more than ever that the online platform is something, if you're not already using, you should review. And we have other webinars that you can go and download from our site to be able to review the features and functionality of that system. But I would like to say that if you're looking for the most accurate data, RS Means Online is the platform that will provide that to you on a daily basis. We invest a lot of time in the update and ensuring the accuracy of our data. We invest over 22,000 hours in the cost research, as well as multiple hours of electronic sourcing and screening of the data, which adds to that. We gather pricing data on more than 52,000 distinct materials, which are contained in over 80,000 unit line items in all of those formats that we discussed earlier. And our labor costs are updated annually, both as OpenShop as well as union rates. We're aware of all of the factors that go into calculating, estimating prices around productivity and labor and location, the sizes of those projects, overtime, etc. And all of those items are taken into account in the data sets that we'll be reviewing today. So moving on to 2016 data at a high level, we have increased the number of unit line items available. We added 500 new lines for our 2016 data sets and removed just over 250 lines, principally items that are either no longer available or dimensions have changed or other items have been affected with those areas. Of the data that we have, roughly 70% of the data has changed in price. We look at the pricing on all materials every year throughout the year. So I don't want you to feel that the 30% that didn't change were not researched. They were researched and covered thoroughly, but there was only 70% that did change. And as you can see, quite a number of those changes, more than 30%, had a change of greater than 5%. I selected 5% for this presentation today just because I believe that's beyond any measure that anybody would have considered as a normal KPI. It's not that we particularly look for that as a benchmark year to year. It changes on a regular basis. But the point that I was trying to make here is that it's difficult for you to understand and generalize and just index whole prices because you don't know whether the price didn't change at all, whether it decreased by more than 5% or whether it increased by more than 5%. And we'll go into great detail through these slides to show you just the range and depth of how much pricing was changed both at material and a labor level. Also, I wanted to cover the amount of changes that happen over time. So as we see, nearly 70% of cost changes occurred between 2015 and 16. But if you compared our data from 2014 to 2016, virtually all of the data changed. 98.8% of the data changed. So particularly for any of the people who may be using a book for our data, if the book is old, now would be the time for you to reconsider the validity of the data that you're using. RS Means prides itself on its depth of research, and it would be obviously remiss of us not to point out that that data changes on a frequent basis. Also, for RS Means Online customers, you have the quarterly updates that are readily available. So you also have the added advantage that your data is continuously updated, and that is pretty critical for a lot of large and important projects. Moving along quickly, if we look at just isolating material costs, because obviously labor costs change frequently from a year-to-year basis because it's very rare that people don't get pay increases. Let's all hope that we are all part of the people that get that increase. So therefore, if we just isolate material costs, we'll see that 31% of unit line items have a material cost increase outside of the 5%. But if you look back from 2014, it rises to 51% and 63% from 2013. So there's a fairly high level of change just at a material level if we even exclude labor, equipment, and productivity. So again, this goes to just highlight the level of the change that's happening throughout the year with our data. Also wanted to come back and just cover with you the areas of new unit lines that we've added by CSI section. This again just helps you understand out of the 500 lines that we have added, it is distributed across the CSI spectrum. It's not that we added a particular single section of new groupings. This was just updates across our entire data set. So I thought it might be useful for us to try and make these price changes updates relevant. So one of the things that we did, I had my analytics team look at the commercial construction spend by CSI section. And as you can see here, structural steel framing was the highest ranked area of spend. So I thought it would be interesting for us to look at the changes for 2016. So we can see that 19 unit lines in that section changed, which represents 6% of the lines. And this is just based on material price changes. If you add in labor, material and equipment, obviously it's much higher. It's up into the 90-odd%. But I wanted to separate out just the material section. And as you can see, if you look at electrical and plumbing, which are some of the biggest areas, they have the highest areas of change at 80% for electrical and 75% for plumbing fixtures. So I just wanted to highlight on this slide, if you look at it on average, there's 63% level of change across these areas, which are the highest areas of spend. So this would add to the criticality of why we need updated pricing and data, because the areas that are used the most also have some of the highest level of change in price. So if we now look across the spectrum of CSI areas, here you can see at a very high level the level of change in the pricing in some of those areas. And this is why, to me, it's dangerous just to take individual indices and apply them, because clearly you can see here that none of these areas fluctuate much beyond a few percent. But as we go through the details of this data, you can see that the ranges of those changes are much different. So we talked earlier about structural steel framing, but if you look at the range of change from 2015 to 16, it's 191%. And for electrical, it's 224%. So it's very important that we understand where those changes are, how much risk does that imply to either your portfolio of buildings to maintain or for the new construction that you're trying to manage and to deliver. And that's the important about why we need to be able to understand the changes and apply them at a detailed level to either a detailed estimate or to a detailed life cycle costing model for your facilities. Adding on to what we were just talking about in terms of change, I wanted to highlight to you here the areas of groups that have changed at the highest rate. So you can see there's 24 CSI groupings here that have 90% more level of change greater than 5%. And a number of these have 100% changing of more than 5%. So clearly it shows that there's some very large changes happening in groupings, and again further underlines the level of change that happens in certain areas and why we need to be able to understand and isolate these areas and see how they impact whatever our portfolio of work is that it entails. So if we move on from some of the more detailed 4-digit level CSIs to the CSI 2-digit divisions, you can see here the percentage of items with a greater than 5% material change. So there's quite a large number of items spread across the spectrum that had some reasonable increases. So you can see in earthworks, for instance, on 31, that 30% of the items had a greater than 5% change in material pricing. Obviously, this highlights that anything that involves some of these key areas would have some risk to their pricing if you were using older data. So moving away from material now and looking at geography and how geography impacts pricing, I thought it would also be interesting to go back to these areas of high spend and understand their change across the US in terms of their pricing. So again, if we go back to structural steel framing, we can see that the variance in price of the materials ranges by 226% across the US. So obviously there's a fairly wide spectrum, and geography has to be brought into account whenever you're working through pricing requirements. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see here, if we picked one specific example, so here this is for urethane foam, by dollar per square foot per R1 of insulation value, and we look at the range of price changes by census region over time, we can see that not only is the distribution getting wider for geography, but that rate of change is increasing. So obviously as we become more sophisticated and data becomes more readily available, clearly the manufacturers and the distributors are monitoring the pricing and varying their pricing based upon location as well as upon material item. So more and more we need to be able to understand and impact the geographical area as well as the material pricing that we're looking at. So as we continue to look at geography, I thought it would be interesting for us to be seeing what are the highest city areas that we believe there is for material pricing groups and what are the lowest. So as you can see here, clearly it's headed by Alaska, but also Texas is a high area of impact. If we separate out just materials, and as we can see over on the right, those areas that enjoy the lowest level of pricing for materials. So if we now look at labor only, we can see that New York is heavily dominant in the labor price, as well as California and Massachusetts. Obviously these are dominated by union locations, which obviously has an impact on the labor rates and productivity. And if we look at labor and material together, you can see that there is a large impact that the labor carries on the pricing, because New York continues to dominate the highest areas of cost. So obviously labor is critical in terms of being able to understand your costs and how that impacts productivity and the overall pricing of your projects. So as we move forward, I'd like to move over now to assemblies and square foot models. All of the data that we've talked about is obviously rolled up and impacts the price changes in our assemblies and square foot models. But on top of that data, we made a very large effort and investment into our assemblies and square foot models in 2015. So you will see that there are some major changes to the 2016 assemblies and square foot models. We undertook a major review of our top utilized plans. So 20 odd of those plans were heavily modified, updated for building codes and the new lighter construction trends that we see. There were more options for wood framing construction in the 1 to 4 story models and a lot more facade updates. So now you have many more options to be able to select and tailor the model to your specific building types and to understand the pricing impacts of the options that are now available to you. So I would like to suggest if any of you have used the square foot models in the past, it would be worthwhile reviewing the details of those square foot models and rerunning some of those models and getting the latest updates that now conform to the latest building codes and standards. If we take, for example, some of the things that we've done in detail, so we did a major review of finished areas. So as an option, if we look at drywall types, where appropriate, we added fire-rated or sound attenuation or impact-resistant drywall. We did this based on talking to a number of major architects and owners in the industries, as well as to major associations across the US and Canada to try and understand what is now getting used and specified more frequently in projects. And so we've tried to make these models more up to date with what we see as being specified now as we do the research across the projects in the area. The partition types have also increased now, so you should be able to see more wood framing and metal studs and concrete block options for partitions. Again, this was just an area that has moved forward over the last few years that we felt that we wanted to focus on, as well as interior necessities. We felt that we didn't have sufficient amounts of lockers and cabinetry in the other interior elements that get added to buildings, while in the past they were more segregated. Now as buildings get more complicated and owners are looking for more levels of sophistication around the levels of cabinetry and the finishes of those cabinetries, we've included a lot more of those options inside the models. So again, please look in detail as you expand your model and you look at the line items details that come out of there. Please feel free to substitute the line items as required for your particular buildings. So the key message I want to get across is our assemblies and square foot models have also changed, not just based on the data updates, but based on substantial modifications that we've made through the year. And I want to also highlight that that will continue through 2016. So again, we will have a number of model updates that come out throughout the year in our RS Means Online product, and they will be included in our 2017 book series when they get published. We've talked here about a number of different changes both across material, labor, and geographies. I wanted to highlight that if we go back to the CSI sections, there was no CSI section with a greater than 7% change. But then when we looked at the detail, we could see that the range changes were as high as 200% in the swings of the pricing changes in 2016. So the devil is always going to be in the detail. And as with your projects, it's critical that you have the detailed pricing information for both labor, equipment, and material, and you can apply that to estimates and to your life cycle costing models and also to your procurement projects, and have a clear understanding of where you have risk in price changes, whether that be in structural steel, in concrete, in lumber, etc. So part of what we're trying to drive here is to highlight that the importance is the detail and being able to track and identify those items and the labor types and the locations that are used and how the prices are being affected. And the only way to do that is to have the detailed data available to you. We try to make that detailed data available in as many formats as possible to make it as easy for you to be able to use, whether that be in a book so you can throw it in the back seat of your truck and drive from place to place, whether that be online so it's always constantly available, and even if you go out and visit your clients, you can pull out the estimate there and then, and if you talk to them about changes, you can implement those changes and understand the impacts of those costings immediately. So we are constantly trying to work and update this data as frequently as possible. You know, we talk about annualized data changes, but we want you to know that every day of the week we are working with various vendors and suppliers and distributors to gather and process that data and make it available. RS Means Online will always be the most up-to-date version of any product that we have. So I'd like to remind you that it is a great tool to have available, and now that we have life cycle costing and other elements that you can add into that product, it's a critical platform for us to be able to make available to as many people as possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. As we all know, the devil is in the details. And before we move into our question and answer session, that will give the whole audience a deeper dive into any questions they may have. I know what we showed you today is a lot to consume, but the mere fact is there's been a lot of change. So we have our final polling question for the webinar. The question is, you'll see on your screen, what types of projects do you use cost data for? Planning and budgeting, new construction, maintenance and repair, or renovations? If you'll go ahead and make your selection. All right. So it looks like it's pretty even. We've got 42% of you that use it for planning and budgeting, followed closely by new construction. So again, thank you for sharing and participating in our polls. So now we want to move on to, again, the question and answer session. Also reminding you that we are recording this and will be sharing with all the registrants. And don't forget, there's a survey at the end as you exit, and we would really appreciate if you could complete that and really help us out in defining what you're looking for and how we can better help you with topics. And with that, we, again, have Bob Mewis, the Director of Cost Engineering, joining us, as well as Chris Anderson. We have a few questions that have already been submitted, so we'll kick those off, but we encourage you to please continue to send those questions in, as we wanted to make this a collaborative conversational discussion in the question and answer. Our first question from you guys is, you talked a lot about material and labor pricing. What about equipment? Is that included? Bob, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Nicole. Yes, all of our equipment prices are reviewed not only for the cost to rent the piece of equipment, but also for what we call the hourly operating costs, which are for such things as fuel and lubrication and maintenance on those items themselves. So we do review the equipment costs. Those are rolled up into the crew costs, which have an impact on the final cost for each item.
Thank you. That's great. I didn't know, Chris, if you had anything to add to that, or if you wanted me to move to the next question.
No, that's perfect. The next question would be great, Nicole.
Okay. Our next question is, are there any economic factors that affect a significant price swing, either positively or negatively? And is that something you look at? Chris, you want to try this?
Sure. I mean, certainly there are a number of key economic items that we monitor closely. So we're looking at commodity pricing. We're looking at major construction trends, where large projects are, what the volume of those projects are, where they are in relation to the source of key materials, how that deals with being able to transport materials, because all those things will have an impact. So we are continuously monitoring a number of large economic items. And Bob, you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, Chris, that the fact that when we're obtaining these prices, particularly on the materials, we are calling the sources the same people that the contractors would be calling for those materials. And obviously they will pass along that same level of pricing with those economic factors already considered or included as part of the cost that they provide us.
Great, thank you. And again, I appreciate you guys. You're a very interactive audience. We have several questions coming in. Our next question, why do you see such a large change in price based on geography?
I'll take that one, Nicole. There's a number of factors that have an impact on that. Where the actual material is produced. So obviously it would be less expensive the closer to its actual production area. What the transportation costs are for that material, not only to get from the manufacturer to the retailer, but then from the retailer to the job site. Economic conditions in that particular region of the country certainly do have an impact as well on what the final cost is for the material. So again, it's good that we are calling to different locations around the country for these prices so that we can get a rounded cost for each one of the materials that we're researching.
Great. Chris, do you have anything to add or should we move on?
No, that's good. Yeah, let's move on.
Okay. The next question is, will you be adding AV visual line items?
I'll take that one, Nicole. Yes, there are enhancements planned and enhancements that went into the data for 2016 in those areas.
Okay. Our next question is, how can you explain plummeting commodity costs with rising cost?
I think some of that, and you know, this is a broad brush question. You'd have to go, you know, area by area in terms of what the commodity is and what materials it's therefore attached to. You know, if you get a very complex piece of electrical equipment that has copper in it, even if the copper pricing is dropping, the material that it's being used may not. That may not be where the key cost is. The cost that's driving that item could be, you know, to do with the IP or the R&D that was used to develop it. I know that wouldn't necessarily apply to a piece of copper pipe. But again, even for that, as we talked about, some of the geographical factors come into account. What's the supply and demand in that area? How far is it from the places that produce that? How much does it cost to move that there? And some of it is just general lag in terms of, you know, the pricing economics, that if a number of the competitors are not dropping their price, then maybe they're not going to start for some time. But ultimately, it is an indicator. It's just a matter about how far things lag in terms of the price change moving up or down in relationship to the commodity moving up or down.
Bob and Chris, which materials have the most change in construction costs for 2016? I'm sorry, which markets have the most change in construction costs for 2016?
Well, I think if you look at the chart that we showed, you know, we clearly highlighted the geographical areas with the highest change. So it was certainly around, you know, New York and Boston, and Alaska was certainly in that chart. So all of those areas, clearly it is different. The drivers, you know, New York was heavily biased towards the labor rate changes. Alaska was more to do with material, and I would probably guess that was not the price of the raw material, but as our materials include a transportation cost, it's probably heavily to do with the transportation costs of moving things around Alaska. So that's certainly the drivers that are in there. Anything you want to add, Bob, around that?
That's a great question. I'd be interested to get a little bit deeper into that. So I would ask the person that sent that question in to shoot me an email. I think it's up on the screen right now, and I'll get. I would be able to provide a little bit deeper information into that.
Perfect. Again, where do you see material and labor costs heading in 2016 and beyond?
I can take to start that one, Chris. Our research usually indicates labor prices are always moving upward. That's the hourly wage paid to the tradesperson. Now, you certainly would get across the construction industry, you would get some people who have been working for a longer time period who might be getting paid more just because of seniority, and then a younger workforce coming in who begins earning at the lower end of a range. But in general, we do see that labor costs are always moving upward. The material costs is, as you saw from the report today, it is a mixed bag, and it really kind of depends on what material we're talking about and in what part of the country. I would expect from my experience here at RS Means, I would expect that across the entire spectrum of materials within our database, anywhere from a 2 to 2.5% increase pretty much every year on materials. That doesn't mean that everything went up that much. It actually indicates that some would go down. But, across the spectrum, anywhere from 2 to 2.5%.
I think there's another number of wider economic factors that, we remain to see how things get played out. So as things change in the oil and gas industry, we saw changes in the labor market. Certainly if you looked up in the Dakotas and some of the things that were happening in Pennsylvania, etc. So now that that market is changing, it will be very interesting to see the reactions in some of those areas, particularly around those labor pools and labor markets, and how that may have dragged people in elsewhere as they moved in to those opportunities. Now are they going to return back from whence they came, and are they going to be swapping out of that industry? So it's hard to be broad brush, but there are a number of items that are out there that could impact either at a micro level in terms of individual items, but even at a macro level in terms of just population drivers and some of the key segments, oil and gas and what's happening in residential housing, etc.
Great. What is the life cycle data mentioned to be added to RS Means Online? Can you please explain?
Do you want me to take that?
Sure.
Okay. So the life cycle data that we have works with our square foot models. If the user has ever seen one of our square foot models before, each one of those models is made up of assemblies. What we have done is we have mapped certain assemblies within each of the square foot models to what we call a maintenance and repair assembly that also has a frequency on it. That frequency meaning how often that work would need to be done. So let's just take, for example, a membrane roof. In our square foot model, we may have a membrane roof included as part of the cost. When we click on the life cycle costing, the computer will then take a look at that membrane roof, and based upon what the age is of the roof that the user enters, will then predict out, let's call it 20 years as being the frequency, to say how much it will be to then remove the existing roof and replace it with a new one. Roofing just being one of the examples of the data that we have. We do have information on that across the spectrum of items that would be applied to the square foot model. So you will get a spreadsheet that shows the different breakdowns of years and the different things or different tasks that need to be performed to that model building over those years and what the costs will be at that time.
The main driver of that product is to provide full life cycle costs. So not only would you know the initial cost of your building, but you will know the expected facility maintenance costs associated with maintaining that building, which is pretty key. We see more and more, particularly in the facilities area. Take for instance a university, it gets a special endowment, they can build a new building because they have the money presented, but they need to try and calculate what the facility maintenance cost will be over its life cycle. And so that product will allow people to help calculate that and understand the total costs involved.
All right, and moving on, our next question is, for equipment, have you also factored in delivery pickup and local fees and taxes?
That's a great question too. So we have separate line items in our database for what we refer to as mobilization and demobilization. We ask that the user enter those line items for the move of the equipment to the job site and then the move of the equipment away from the job site. Just so everybody is aware, we do not include local taxes in anything of our costs from RS Means. We do rely upon the local user to apply those taxes as appropriate.
Okay. So some members of the audience were very excited about the life cycle cost options and wanted to know, will you be expanding the number of these assemblies again this year?
So certainly, yes, we will be.
I love it. Straight and to the point. The next question is the data automatically updated, revised in our online data? So there must be an online user. So is that automatically updated and revised?
A good question. So we have a quarterly update process in place now, and we are working with our product team to make a much more frequent update model available, where you would either be able to select from the latest prices that we have available, you could select from monthly or quarterly updates. So we are trying to increase the frequency at which we refresh that data to the online product. Also, one of the things we probably should mention around the life cycle costing, right now we have inflationary indexes that we apply, and we are working with our analytics team to come up with much more sophisticated algorithms for both trending of those prices and to do more predictive pricing. So we also envisage that the life cycle costing predicting prices will become much more analytical in nature and therefore very tightly measured.
Bob and Chris, how do you develop the productivity rates and what's it based on?
That's a great question too. I'll try to be brief. Actual field measurements where we actually go and observe a product being installed. Information from contractors on how long it takes them to install a particular item. Information from vendors. As you probably know, a lot of vendors will have information on what the installation cost or an installation time is. We have to combine that kind of information along with the relative crew that would be involved. And also our experience here, the engineers here at RS Means are all experienced construction professionals. Many of them have a lot of hands-on experience in addition to their time overseeing. So we do rely upon that as well.
And if somebody has any feedback, we would welcome any feedback that they may have, and our email addresses are on here.
I apologize for interrupting you. This actually goes back to a question that you just recently responded to. And the audience attendees understood that you to say that the equipment does not include sales tax. They know that material does not. And is there a line item for that, but not for equipment? Could you please clarify?
We have a section in Division 1 that shows the high and the low sales tax in the United States. And then there is a reference number, both available in the back of any publication or in the reference sections of the CD or the online product. They do spell out what we know of as for sales tax. And those are just to the state level. Sometimes counties or even localities will have additional sales tax, but the most that we get down to is the state level. We do not have a specific line item that is for a specific state. It's more of a general thing.
And have you seen a reduction in contractor and or subcontractor profit markups due to the competitive bidding environment?
I'll take that one, Nicole. I haven't seen that. No, I haven't seen that being reported at all. We are here in the Boston area, and construction is booming. So we have been, I don't think that we're seeing drops in the overhead and profit markups at all in this area. I'd have to dive a little bit deeper into our research to see if we found anything anywhere else. So again, if that person would like to shoot me an email, I can respond to them.
Thank you. We'll have a few more questions. Why are the low oil and fuel costs not pulling down more the cost of materials? Maybe we should take that one offline, perhaps.
Well, I'm thinking about that. I think it's more complicated than that. The fuel costs, relatively speaking, could be rather minor in terms of the overall cost of what is happening in that area. And if the supply is strong enough, they will not reduce that at any significant level. I still see items that are being delivered, and there's still a fuel surcharge on the bill. So despite the fact that fuel is, dropped significantly, that doesn't mean to say that those savings are being passed through to the different areas. So we do try and take that into account when we take the pricing, but we're not necessarily seeing that in reality. And to be honest, I can't answer that. We'd have to go into a more detailed locale and material, etc., to look at that.
Okay, and it's around 15 till the top of the hour, and we like to keep our webinars just under an hour. So we're just going to answer one more question now. The rest that we have are a lot more technical in nature to respond and would be better suited for Chris and Bob to have those one-on-one discussions with those attendees. So our last question for today is, are your city cost indexes adjusted to reflect current market conditions?
I'll take that one, Nicole. So the answer to that is yes. So they are adjusted quarterly based upon wage rates paid to tradespeople and material prices within that particular location. So you should see changes in the city cost index each quarter, whether it's up or down. You should see some changes.
Thanks. And actually, I didn't want to overlook, we had one more question that came in, and I didn't want them to feel left out because I felt like it'd be easy for you to address. Has RS Means ever looked at the Canadian marketplace pricing?
I'll take that one too, Nicole. Yes, we do have. I believe we track 63 locations in Canada, of which we will show 17 of those. We're doing the same research there as we do in any U.S. city and present that in that city cost index or location factor tables.
And ironically, I would like to add that we even produced metric sets of our data, although the highest amount of data that's actually purchased for use in Canada is in imperial measurements rather than metric. but we do certainly have that data available, and we've also undertaken a number of custom consulting cost study projects in Canada. So we have a very good understanding of the marketplace.
Great. Well, with that, we want to go ahead and wrap up today. Again, I'll want to remind you we'll be sending out a copy of the recording of the webinar later this week. And any of the questions that we were not able to address, we will contact you and address those individually, as well as if you need any more information on the questions that were answered today but would like more in-depth and detailed responses, please feel free to contact Chris Anderson, and then he can communicate with Bob and really get together to answer those questions. Again, I ask you politely to please complete the survey as you leave today's webinar, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Thanks again.
Thank you.